Everybody, on to topic 4 we go. Looking now at international applications and playing to the international audience. So we're looking at here maybe a case where a country's trying to prove its own case to its own people by doing well internationally. It may be trying to prove a point to the international community by doing well internationally. It may be trying to just prove it exists by doing something with the international community. So it doesn't mean that it's limited to only international engagements. It's how you engage with sports to the international community, perhaps in regards to your domestic audience. I want to say a word before we begin here about all these different footballs. OBTW. Oh, by the way, football. There's so many footballs going around, and it begs some clarification. So, football is a phrase that pertains to a whole host of different sports that all have the same genesis. So, association football is what you and I know better as soccer, or just football in a lot of places. The soccer part of it comes from the SOC out of the middle of association, and so soccer was an abbreviation that the British actually came up with. It didn't catch in Britain, but certainly caught here. You've got NFL American football, you've got Gaelic football, you've got rugby football union that's actually from the same branch of football. You've got Australian football. You've got several others. So football's a little bit confusing, but it all comes from that same root. And sometimes when you hear people sort of criticize American football for not being played with the foot, you think, oh, well, it turns out that when you look at the other games that have roots in football, like Aussie rules football and rugby union football and stuff, that it's not that dissimilar to those after all. They just come from different roots of the old football tree. The point sort of is that when you start looking at sports space and what occupies a sports space, for it to be internationalized well, you need to replicate it well. So one of the things that happened with football when it was developed in Britain, the different kind of footballs, is some turned into national sports, right? So American football is something that's not very well replicated outside of our sports space. In other words, you might find some foreigners, some people from other countries who come here and play football, and every once in a while there's attempts to take an NFL game and put it in another country to play some games outside the United States. And there was an abortive attempt to have a World League of American football that was in Europe, but it's not really in anyone else's sports space, no matter how often we have a game in London or have a game in Tokyo or a game in Mexico City. Right? It stays in our sports space. Gaelic football, as neat as it is pretty much located uniquely in Ireland. So those sports aren't replicated often enough to be useful in an international sports space or an international political or international affairs setting. So what mattered was empires that spread at a time when spreading a culture was important to the colonizing power. Not all empires spread their own sport. We'll look at that here in a little bit. But a major way for sports to spread was for a culture to spread through a single unified entity. So if we look at the sports that are replicated in the most sports spaces abroad, you find things that come from the British Empire primarily, and then some other things that come later. So the oldest one of these, the oldest global sport, the one that spread earliest, is cricket. So this actually spreads with the old British Empire. When I say old British Empire, I'm talking about one that was focused, yes, on trade, but also on colonization, where you tried to take the British Empire all around the world and set up colonies of people who came from Britain and established mini Britons anywhere they went. You'll find that as you get later into the 19th century, as you get to the 20th century, it becomes more of a trading enterprise and less of a conquering, colonizing enterprise. As you know, a lot of the colonials get. That doesn't mean they didn't keep colonies for a long time, but they're not establishing new ones. And as they come to new markets in those eras, they're not sort of taking their whole society, a whole cloth. But cricket moves a lot. And so this will be the first time you'll see some of these entities introduced in this class here. This is about a third of the way through the class. And you'll see in this list of teams that were in the Cricket World Cup, which was held in 2015, won by Australia, a new entity that you haven't seen before. It's called the West Indies. And the West Indies is not an independent nation, right? It's not in the UN, but it is made up of various independent countries in this West Indies, which are in the Caribbean, who band together for the purposes of cricket and compete as a unified team. They won a couple of Cricket World Cups in the 1970s. Very big deal to have the small colonials beat their former colonial masters. That those tournaments happen in England. It was a very big deal. It's the oldest global sport, and you find them where the oldest English societies were located. And so most of this is what you can see. There are some new things that they try to branch the game out, where the UAE comes in, but all these other places were things where you had old English settled empires. The exception of one that is not part of the settlement who didn't keep cricket would be the United States. And to a lesser extent, Canada, where casting off that former colonial tie through cricket was an important thing. One of the reasons we turned to baseball, which is related in some ways to cricket and lacrosse, is one where we're turning to our own sport as our own nationalist sense. In the others, they decide to beat the colonizer at their own game and develop those sports there. So old colonies. The next two, so the first one then is cricket. The second one are the two footballs that spread through the British Empire. So obviously something called American football, or something called Gaelic football, or something called Australian rules football don't spread through the British Empire. They're developed in those countries, their own unique things. But rugby union and association football both spread through the British, and there's sort of different parts of the British society that spread them. We're not going to belabor that point here, but again, you're going to see different sorts of states appear on these. So then you have the group of countries that played in the 2011 Rugby World Cup and the 2015 Women's World Cup of Soccer here. So one of the things you'll see is a group of states that appear in the Rugby World Cup that you would have noticed on the member states comparison assignment but haven't really come up so far. Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, these countries that have an old relationship with Brits who come into the Pacific and spread the game at that time, and who still are very dedicated to the sport, and then that sport is in their sports space. They get a chance to sort of encounter England in those settings where you have World Cup matches like that. And the football is sort of the same way. It comes from the British spreading it around the world in their empires in the 19th century. And now is spread around the world. Again, you have some newer entities that you haven't seen yet, except in that member states assignment. For example, Thailand in the women's game, and some others like that. So the footballs are the second of the second and third of the four main ones, and the third one is come the Americans. Baseball is one of the global sports, and you've got an article assigned this time that considers whether baseball spreads far and wide enough to be a global sport. William Kelly's article will take you into that, but it's certainly in the Americas, in Central America and the Caribbean, there's a lot of baseball that leads to some opportunities for the countries to come together. So again, with American football, we said that, for example, you'll have people who are Polynesians, who are from Samoa, who are from Tonga, and places like that, who become American football players and come here to play in college football or pro football. But that doesn't mean that the sport is replicated in those sports spaces. There's baseball players who come from all over the world, and there are baseball players then that are in the U.S. League that are not sort of distinct from their baseball traditions at home, that instead of converting from, say, rugby to playing American football when they move here or attempt to make a change to break into a different sport, these folks come from baseball traditions in the Caribbean, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, in Venezuela, in parts of Colombia, in parts of Mexico, in Nicaragua, in Japan, and a host of other places. And so the consideration is this a fourth global sport? Is one that's replicated enough times to matter? And if it's replicated enough times, the other challenge would be, is the American League too powerful and control too much of the market for it to really percolate up into too much of the market? That'll be something to consider when you read the Kelly article. There's some contenders, some sports that are played in enough places that are starting to emerge. Basketball is still a relatively new game around the world. Again, they have the challenge with the NBA being perhaps too powerful, and maybe FIBA is the International Federation for basketball doesn't have as much power as the NBA does, but it's certainly one that's expanding and growing. The question is always is the NBA trying to grow the game to benefit the NBA or to benefit the sport? And sometimes those are related and sometimes they aren't. Same sort of thing with hockey. Hockey does have that artificial control of needing to be in a place where there's enough ice that people are interested enough in wintertime sports to play it. So it is still a global north phenomenon. But particularly with the breakup of the Soviet Union, where the USSR went from one hockey state to a dozen hockey states, spread the number of countries that were still engaged in the game considerably. And so those certainly are contending sports. And you may see those growing even more in the future. They are replicated enough times that you do have very interesting sports and international affairs, such as hockey and basketball, enough times. The Olympics would be then one of these international forums, but unequally. And now we're talking about whether you can have sporting prowess in the Olympics. Because for a lot of states, being at the Olympics is enough, right? That's why you would want to have a NOC, right? A National Organizing Committee. So you'd want to be, say, this picture here is from the Vancouver opening ceremonies. You want to walk in that ceremony. We show the picture of the Vanuatuan athletes marching in that ceremony. You want to be there. You want to be seen. You want to be heard. You want to be acknowledged alongside those other states. But most countries in the world can't hope to compete in the Olympics and can't hope to sort of focus on it to do more than just represent, to just be represented. So in Sochi Olympics in 2014, you had the most ever number of National Olympic committees present. There were 88. So that means you didn't even make half, right? You didn't even have half of the countries represented there. And sometimes some of those are, the random skier or somebody who realizes that because they live in Washington State and they ski, and their home country is somewhere in Africa, that they may be the best winter athlete they've ever had and can qualify. So sometimes those numbers are inflated. So what they're trying to do now with the Olympics is a little different than they used to do, is not let all comers. There's some infamous events where you have people who, for example, don't know how to go off the Olympic ski jump, come to compete in Olympic ski jumping and wipe out spectacularly, which is kind of popular. People kind of enjoyed it, but they feared made a mockery of it. Or people who'd never swam before show up to swim. And so they've done away with some of that, and we'll talk about that later in the class. Also, so you've got 74 current member states, current NOCs in the IOC who've never won a medal. You've got another 26 who've only won one, another 11 who've only won two. So there you're at 111 states who've never won more than two medals. There have been several dozen Olympiads, both winter and summer. And so while it's great for the United States to say we're going to prioritize this, and we've won something like 2,700 medals all time, most states can't hope to do that. It's nice. So I wore my Aussie jersey for this lecture, right? And the other time we talked about that relationship between politics and sport, where the Aussies are trying to emphasize winning at the Olympic Games. They're a country of a size to do that. So the Olympics are unequal because a lot of states are trying to be there. They'd love it if they won a medal. It's a great deal, right? That's why we did that sort of introductory activity where you looked at states that only won one medal and what it means to them. But the Olympics are actually used unequally for these sorts of things. That doesn't mean they don't take advantage of them when they arise. And we'll look at some of those examples as we go through. So what does this all mean? Well, international efforts to politicize sport depend a lot on the frequency of the sport being replicated in other sports spaces. It doesn't help you to say, I'm going to internationalize Gaelic football. Now, there is some attempt. I met with some representatives from the Irish embassy, the Irish consulate in San Francisco, who said, yeah, we try and teach Gaelic football out of our consulates, but what they're trying to do is teach Gaelic, some Gaelic and Irish culture in a safe space. No one else will play Gaelic football. They're not trying to establish Gaelic football leagues around the world, and it would take so long to do that. It would be challenging to ever break into some of that sports space to make it replicated. So they can use it as sort of a cultural badge, but it's hard to replicate it. You need to have those sports. So there'll be lots of chances for individual sports to play into this. We'll look more at tennis and track and field in particular, boxing in particular, as we go forward. And sports like that do give some chances because you can put forward an individual athlete, right? We can't de-emphasize how much Manny Pacquiao means to Filipinos who are watching him box and what he means to the country. It might be easier for them to put forward someone like him than, say, a team in baseball, a team in soccer, rugby, etc. Anyway, so replicating sports space, that matters. So next we'll look at what happens when all these sort of things come together. When the international community knows that countries value sport, that they're interested in using sport for their own ends, what then do they do? What can they do to affect change in those states if they want to?